And Lara, even as we record, I know I've indicated this once before, but I'll just reiterate it that these presentations are in our Google slide deck, and so they are available if or participants need access.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, in their entirety.
I guess we could start, Pastor.
Okay, you go ahead and pull them up. How's everybody doing today?
Good.
That is good, and it is good to be with you all. Last week we were talking about participatory action and the importance of, involving people closest to the issues in the decisions about, how economies of food, garden economies, farm economies, how they are actualized. And one of the things we talked about last week was the reality that in many instances, people with the most knowledge, people with the most to lose, the biggest stakeholders, are not often asked or respected by the powers that be, whether it's corporations, whether it's the government. And we need to make sure that those farmers in particular, as we're talking about urban agriculture and farming, that those farmers are the people that really have the depth of knowledge and expertise. And so, it seems ironic that we would prescribe, policies that don't, farm policies or food policies that don't include the people, who are growing. And that's a problem in our food system. That is a problem in agriculture. That is a problem often in policy and planning in general. So today, we're really going to be talking about land justice or land access, and how land is often used, in global settings as well as national settings. But even when we talk about urban agriculture, how land is used as a tool often to deny people access, to deny people their own empowerment when it comes to having real say-so. And that's true whether you're talking about housing, whether you're talking about education, whether you're talking about the environment, whether that has to do with access to green spaces, green areas, access to parks or playgrounds of nature and open space. And alas, when it comes to farming and gardening. And that's not just for rural areas, but that is true even in urban areas. One of the other programs that we run at the Center for Food, Faith, and Justice, our Beyond the Table job training program. We have people in that program that have been a part of what is known and called guerrilla gardening efforts. Anyone know what guerrilla gardening is or have ever heard of that term before?
Yeah, that's sneaking plants into public land.
That's right. That's right. And it is sneaking plants into public and even in some cases private land where people will say that they haven't had access to, right? And they'll grow. So last week we were talking about the gill tract, farm in Albany, and we were talking a little bit about what happened with the Occupy the Farm movement. That would be a glaring effort of guerrilla gardening. If you know that, that's interesting because the Gill Tract technically is a public space, but it's also a private space. Long story short, what we were talking about last week is that, a group of urban gardeners actually entered the Gill Tract and basically just started farming on that land. That's at that time that was a 17-acre parcel of land. They, started on 1 acre and eventually, started to guerrilla garden on several acres before they were removed by the university police, the Alameda County Sheriff's Department, and officers, local law enforcement officers from different jurisdictions, Albany, Berkeley, Oakland, so have you. And there's a lot of controversy around guerrilla gardening. Well, is it fair? How can people commandeer public spaces or private spaces? And whatever your feelings or agreements or disagreements are, the real issue that we have to address is the issue of land use and policy. That is true, in our cities, in urban settings, but it also, is true nationally and globally. And for some people and for some community groups, and especially many indigenous groups, it has far-reaching consequences and complications. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then next week, we're going to get more practical again. We're going to be talking about seeds and seed savings and ancestral seeds. But we really want to, invoke this conversation around land use and land access. So Mike, if you want to get started, we're all good. So as he brings this up, the issue, of land power and inequality, those things really go together. Oftentimes, the people that don't have access to land when it comes to farming in the urban or rural setting, usually there's a major power imbalance. And there are usually some issues and often systems of inequality at work as it relates to the issues. It could be issues around economics. It could be issues around race or gender, identity. It could be, a lot of issues that really kind of feed into it. But make no mistake about it, the issue of land use is tied inextricably in most cases, to money and economics. Next. So to understand that, we need to really kind of go back and understand the roots of American land justice, right? And so you have to remember, how this nation was settled, right? Waves of dispossessed European settlers, often left Western Europe to come to America, right? And as they came, there were indigenous people already there, right? And so of the indigenous communities that were already there, the settlers' entrance into America often kind of disrupted, destroyed village and communal life. And you got to really think about that, right? It is also important to remember the early roots of America as an agrarian society that really changed with the Industrial Revolution, right? And so, ultimately, agriculture was regulated to serve the needs of the Industrial Revolution. And Eric Holt Jimenez, who is a big time food activist, international activist, and urban farmer, really talks about you can't separate that from the early settling of America and the roots of land justice. Next. And so, how does that relate to agroecology? We started talking about agroecology a couple of weeks ago, and agroecology, that system that really talks about nature and agriculture working together. One of the things about most agroecology activists, they will say to you, without land, right, or land justice-based alternatives, to the current corporate system, you can't really have true agroecology about it, right? And so, they would say, those activists would say that, there have been trends advancing ideologies of patriarchy or white supremacy, or violence, have been not just actualized in the United States, but throughout different parts of the globe that really, embody the corporate structure of why, without land, you can't have agroecology. I'm going to pause there for a minute and say, when Michael and I started teaching agroecology classes about 5 years ago, and we were really working with groups of what the U.S. Department of Agriculture terms as socially disadvantaged farmers. That's the USDA's language, not mine. But they designate people as socially disadvantaged farmers if you fall into different groups that have been historically marginalized. So you could be part of the Latinx community, you could be part of the African American community, you could be part of the AAPI community, you could be part of the LGBTQ community, you could be a woman, but all of those groups would be deemed in the farming realm as socially disadvantaged. And so the thing when Michael and I started teaching these classes, the reality was it was to prepare so-called socially disadvantaged communities or farmers to become emerging farmers. And by that, they had to have been in the farming field or farming business for less than 5 years. And, we had all these great presentations, all these great trainings, and we were bringing in, subject matter experts from UC Berkeley and from Alameda County and from UC Co-op Extension and all these places. But the one thing that the participants in those classes were pushing back on us is like, man, this is really cool. And it's great that we're learning all these techniques and all these strategies, to do, farming and food production. However, if we don't have access to land, what good is it for us? What good is it to us? And I'm going to let Michael chime in from his perspective. But when they would say that to us, there wasn't a lot we could really say back other than, knowledge is power, and you got to think about it. Mike, any thoughts about that as you go to the next slide?
Yeah, I would just like to say that was a big issue. I mean, we were teaching classes and we were teaching kids that were in college, which would be agroecology or farm related stuff, and they're, even though they enjoyed but the other things that we got to teach them about connecting, native lands to and the rights of indigenous peoples and all that. They're like, well, we don't have access to land, so how do we do that? So that was a reoccurring question that we never really got to answer. So it's always on our mind.
Yeah, and it is a big challenge because, we would take people through like a 3-month seminar, and they had an option, to do a 6-month internship after that. And several people also did the internship. But the question that we would always receive back is, okay, so, we're going to spend this time with you guys. And even if I do the internship, you guys are going to give me, like $500 to implement a project or a program. And that's cute. But if I don't even have as much of a quarter acre to start farming, or gardening on, was I really wasting my time? And that's something that we have to be honest about. So agroecology is not possible without land justice. So, you start thinking about the issues of land justice. A couple of things, and I was talking about this earlier in another class, right? As it related to Black farmers, in full confession, my mother's family were farmers. They owned a small plot of land on the Texas-Louisiana border, which actually they still own today. It's about 17 acres. And another family related to us owned another 30 acres on the other side. And, that land is still there. It's ancestral land that's, been there for generations. For Black folks in the United States, in 1920, there was about 1 million Black farmers, on 41 million acres of land, farming throughout the United States. Today, there's only about 49,000 farmers and 1% of farm owners, right? On 4 million acres or 4.7 million acres of land represents a 99% land loss. Why do I bring that up? Because vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance talked about a settlement that supposedly Black farmers received from the Biden administration. And this is where you have to be real careful about misinformation. J.D. Vance said that we shouldn't be doing anything for Black farmers. We should be helping all farmers, which is true. But J.D. Vance was not telling the truth because, number one, that bill, which is mistitled a Black farm bill, it is not just for Black farmers. It is for all socially disadvantaged farmers, even though it was characterized as a Black farm bill. And it was characterized as a Black farm bill because there were African-American farmers who historically brought those issues before the United States government because they were able to prove that the policies that the USDA had instituted and helped co-opt along with local, city and county governments over that 100-year period, were inherently biased and racist in their practices. The other piece about it was, what J.D. Vance wasn't honest about and not clear about was that he said we shouldn't be giving anything to Black farmers. There wasn't given. It was a settlement brought on by a lawsuit that had been proven by years of discrimination. And again, and it wasn't even only, for Black farmers. it was for any socially disadvantaged farmers. And so this is where you got to be careful about how people characterize stuff. Next slide. And part of the problem is it avoids the issue. It avoids the issue of land access and what it's about. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the reality is this was no accident. I just kind of talked about this. These were policies that were intentional and deliberate and designed to move people off their land. And this is an issue and a strategy that has not just happened in the United States, but it's happened, throughout the globe in many cases. Keep going. And so, when we talk about agroecology and land-based agroecology and process thinking, right, it is important to understand the historical effort to free the land, right, and to produce clean and more just food systems. The thing that is really linked to the way agriculture is done also creeps into the food system, because to mass produce agriculture is heavily reliant on chemical inputs, fossil fuel based fertilizers and things like that. Big corporate structures for mass production. It's not about the family farmer. It's not about the woman who's just trying to feed, her community and her family. It becomes corporate farms. And when corporations move in like that, oftentimes those big sprawling farms, they forget, about the little person. They forget about that woman. They forget about that guy, who's just trying to feed his family. And they're really not taken into consideration. And oftentimes for indigenous communities, for marginalized communities, that blow, is much worse. And so we need a new way of thinking that's not only about the land, but about the food that we produce. I'm going to pause there. Any questions, any comments before we keep going? If not, Mike, let's go to the next slide. So oftentimes there's been pushback. Folks in the food movement have said that even efforts of land reform, are incomplete because they often don't really listen to the voices. So again, if you go back to last week when we were talking about participatory action, right, where it was really important to gain the voices of the farmers, the ones, again, closest to the issues on the ground. Oftentimes, land reform policies that come out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the Bureau of Land Management and other places, oftentimes they are created by elected officials, by government officials, not necessarily by the people who are most affected. And so oftentimes, folks will say, oh, well, we're going to do land reform, but you really haven't consulted or listened to the folks that are really dealing with the issues right there. And so oftentimes there is a big pushback. Oftentimes, there have been indigenous farmers, Black farmers, Latinx farmers who have said, how can you talk about land reform and you haven't even consulted us, who are experiencing the bulk of this pain? Next slide. It is important to understand, if we really look at Latinx farmers in the United States, right? If you really think about it, right, they only own about 3% of farms in the United States, but they make up 83% of the field labor on American farms. There's an imbalance there, right? The low number of Latinx farm owners is misrepresentative of who's farming now today, right? The publication Civil Eats follows this a lot. I was talking earlier about the injustice around Latinx farm workers, and I shared an example of a farm that we were working with. And we used to get a lot of organic produce from this particular farm. I'm not going to mention the name of the farm, but it is a farm that prides itself on being very inclusive, very progressive. It is a farm in Northern California, um, you know, and really talks about how it treats, its farm workers with dignity and equity. And the truth is that when the pandemic hit, many of those farm workers were getting sick and they were still being forced to come to work. Michael and I have built a relationship with the farm manager or the farmer's market manager, who's an extension of that farm, and the assistant farmer's market manager, where we were getting the produce from. And she got wind of the fact that the farm leadership, the farm owners, were forcing people to come to work. And many of these people were first generation. Most of them, English was not their first language. And they were almost being bullied and intimidated to come working on the farm when they were sick with COVID. And she kept explaining to them that wasn't a good idea and that they needed to take the time to get well, to protect themselves, to protect each other, protect their families. And they were saying, but what do you want us to do? Because we're getting threatened with being fired. We don't really have other avenues of income. What are we going to do? And so she and the assistant farm manager were trying to help them organize a union on site, or a chapter of the United Farm Workers on site at this particular farm. And when the farm leadership found out, rather than addressing the fact that they were, trying to force people to come to work when they were sick, they fired everyone. That's the reality, oftentimes, of the injustice that folks deal with, and why they need access to their own land, their own farms, oftentimes, because that is part of the imbalance that we encounter. Questions, comments? All right, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you this example, and I'm going to stop and open up for some discussions. This is a real interesting case study. Borlaug Hall at the University of Minnesota is named after Norman Borlaug, who is considered to be the founder and father of the Green Revolution, right? And so, this begins at the University of Minnesota. Norman Borlaug has a whole wing named after him. So Cargill Foods, which is a big food producer. Some will say food polluter, but they donated a whole wing in Borlaug's honor. The thing about Cargill and companies like that, they promote not indigenous practices, which they actually moved many indigenous communities off the land, but they moved, indigenous communities off the land and replaced their native practices with a more monoculture approach to agriculture. Let me just ask y'all, because you're going to be, doing your gardens in your own backyards. What, if any, is a problem with monoculture, or some of the issues related to monoculture?
If you get a pest that affects that plant, then your whole crop is gone.
There you go. If all you're doing is planting one crop, and there is a particular pest, right, that comes in and sees your corn or your lettuce, just as smorgasbord, and they multiply, your whole crop is destroyed. And part of the reason why we look at polyculture systems, and we encourage you in your gardens, your personal gardens or your community gardens, to be more engaged in strategies such as polyculture and intercropping, is having multiple crops, lends itself, to your plants, your crop, your yield being less susceptible to pests that come your way. And so what do you think? So if monoculture becomes susceptible to particular pests, what do you need to do to prevent that?
Pesticides.
Pesticides. So now you got a whole nother problem. So now you done poisoned the crops, you done poisoned the soil, right? Because rather than engaging in some of, those cultural and ancestral practices that are far more natural, because your haste is with monoculture, you're trying to do cash crops because you need to quickly get it to the market in mass. So now what you got to do is you got to get fertile, chemical-based fertilizers, petroleum-based fertilizers that are going to be harmful, to your plants, to your soil. But this is what you got to do, because you need to move this stuff out of the ground to the markets quick. That was disastrous to many of the indigenous communities around the University of Minnesota, where Norman Borlaug, started the Green Revolution, and became world renowned for his practices and his theories. So then we need to think about the harm that does to the earth, the harm that does to the soil, the harm that does to the microbes in the soil, and the organisms, the living and non-living organisms around. What does that mean? And how is that transferred into human and non-human bodies if you're consuming the food, or if you're just on the soil? That becomes a problem. And when the indigenous communities push back, that was not good for their native practices, what do you think happened?
Police.
Say that again?
The police or the government came in and probably said,
yeah, at best they were ignored, but in many cases they were moved off the land. They were moved off the land. They became no more than another pest in the monoculture, cropping of the land. That's the reality. Next slide. So, one of the things we need to think about, local indigenous farming, and this relates to what you're doing in terms of, community gardening, right? There is, an effort to restore sustainable landscapes, right? To also contribute to new and emerging food sheds. I think one of the great things, anybody here in Berkeley familiar with the crop swap?
Yes.
So the crop swap is a great example, of sustainable landscapes. People in their own backyards, people, in communal areas, and they're growing and they're swapping crops. It doesn't matter if it's potatoes or onions or tomatoes that you're growing in a healthy, organic way, and people are coming together. The other piece of that, right, when we started talking about, creating new and emerging national food sheds, the one thing that doesn't get talked about enough are the stories. I was sharing with a group earlier today that in one of the programs I used to run, one of the most important things we used to do is that we had an exercise that we would ask each of the participants, what is the favorite food, that you or your family consumed over the years, and why? Is it something that, your parents or grandparents, or a family member, is it something they prepared only on special occasions? Did your grandma make it when you were sick? Did you have it only on birthdays or certain celebrations? What is the food? What is, the familial significance of the food? What, if anything, is the cultural significance of the food? Is there a story behind the dish? Is there a story behind the food? And we would share those things, right? And then, what we would do in a communal effort, that you had to exchange that recipe with somebody else in the group, and you had to prepare the recipe that you received, and that person had to prepare the recipe that they received, and then we would kind of reflect and talk about it. Growing is the same thing. Michael and I often talk about, in our, organic garden efforts, we're growing on multiple sites, and we talk about not just the produce that we're growing, the different produce that we're growing, and how it grows differently in certain microclimates. But Michael often talks about where we are at the church, particularly in the summer when we're growing a lot of chili peppers, that, there are folks, that come in from the community, and particularly a lot of older members of the API community, and they see that we're growing things like Thai chilies and things like that, and they'll just stare. And Michael will invite them, would you like to come pick some? When he goes around the corner at the garden that we take care of for the young adult project that we grew and planted over there, there are communal groups that come in and say, wow, how can we be involved? It's not just the food and the foodscape, but it's the stories that we tell and the togetherness that we share, that we can find within each other on the land. So those are really important things, and particularly in our indigenous communities that are often been pushed to the side and forgotten about, how much more is that important to their cultural landscapes and their ancestral histories and the rich history of this nation that we need to share. Next slide, please. So I was kind of talking about that. I'm going to say this and then I'll stop. UC Berkeley in recent years has had to do land acknowledgements, particularly of the Ohlone and the Miwok peoples that are indigenous to this area. And you know that the UC Berkeley campus is essentially on Ohlone territory. That is a huge issue. There are local indigenous groups, Segorte Land Trust, among others, that have really challenged, all of the Bay Area, but especially here in Alameda County, and especially and particularly at UC Berkeley, to make it right when it comes to the issue of land equity and land justice, because it's not just about farming and food sheds, but it also has, cultural, social, and economic significance. And in essence, the university has, at least at this point, acknowledged that the injustice has been done and the ongoing harm to the Ohlone peoples, has not been alleviated, and it needs to be understood. I think more can and should be done, but the reality is there is at least an acknowledgement of that. I'm going to stop there. If there are any comments about land justice, or questions that you want to have, and after that, I'm just going to talk about how that relates to what we're doing in this class and what your efforts are.
I suspect that part of the problem is the way politicians and legislators have to collect money, corporate money, to pay for their campaigns, that they be beaten out by somebody else if they didn't get the big bucks from big sources. And that small-time farmers just, they might give $100 or $1,000, but that doesn't mean anything to the politician who needs $1 million to fund his campaign.
Absolutely, and that's right on point, and that's the truth, and that goes hand in hand with perception. So all the stuff that I've talked about earlier, as it relates to you and what you're doing, right? The truth is that until the last 15 or 20 years, and even in Berkeley, as progressive as Berkeley is, I'd say the last 10 years, urban agriculture or urban farming has historically not been taken seriously. That people say that's cute, these are just a bunch of green beanies, they're just radical people that want to do this. They don't really think about the importance of urban agriculture as it relates to backyard gardening or backyard farming and community food resilience. I'm still old enough to remember, when even in this neighborhood that I'm in Berkeley, when just about everybody on the block had a garden. We didn't call it a crop swap. We didn't call it a crop swap back in the early 70s. Folks just shared. Some people were growing plums and apples in their backyard. Other people, were growing potatoes. People were growing tomatoes and greens and lettuces, and we just shared it. We didn't call it a crop swap, but that's how folks did. And there was something about growing in community, and particularly when you're growing naturally and organically, and it wasn't about what had to get to market. As things and times went on, the more we continued to modernize and industrialize, folks continue to move away from those practices. And so it does not behoove the politician, just as you say, and it surely doesn't behoove, corporate entities to say, oh, we're going to center, small urban agriculture and backyard farmings. No, we want mass producers and mass distributors come in, because that's how we move towards economies of scale. And you're absolutely right that it doesn't matter if, in the local community, the local individual, or the small grassroots groups, they give a politician, $500 or $1,000. Well, that's not moving the needle, because now they really need, these political action committees, who are going to give major donations to keep getting them funded. And you're not attracting corporate interest, talking about small land use things like urban and community gardens or backyard gardening policies. The truth is, though, the city of Berkeley, along with other cities, I think Oakland has one, San Francisco definitely has one. They have these urban farm policies where now, in a single use kitchen, you can not only grow, but you can sell products that you produce on site. So, whether you are, growing chickens and you want to sell the eggs, or you're growing plums or apricots and you want to make jams and jellies, or you're growing chilies and you want to make hot sauce, you can sell out of your kitchen. There's still licensing things that you got to do. But part of that is, as we really look at what foodscapes need to be, there should be a changing dynamic. But that does not deny the need for land access to grow in the first place. And it does not deny the issue of the justice pieces, as I was sharing earlier, of those so-called socially disadvantaged or marginalized groups who have often and historically been moved off of land. I know we only got 10 minutes left. I'm going to stop there for any other questions or comments that you all have. I'm hoping that this has been helpful and it kind of brings things back to why we're doing what we're doing. Any thoughts, any questions? And if I bored you for the last 50 minutes, I don't have a big ego, so you can tell me.
Very good to understand the context that we're all in. Really helpful.
All right, and again, we have access. You all have access to all this stuff. Obviously, these presentations are more than what I'm sharing with you. You don't, get the full gist. Michael and I teach this, to larger community groups as well. And those classes last like a minimum of 2 hours each. But you have access to all of this information, and so we'll continue to do that. Next week, we're going to start talking about seed saving. And even as we talk about seed saving, we'll talk about the importance of ancestral seeds and what those seeds really mean, and why we should be doing seed saving, and Mike will probably walk you out back in the garden as well. Laura, Mike, is there anything else? I know it's like almost 4:25.
No, I'm just showing them the course or the place where the videos will be contained. So I will take this video, make it into a YouTube clip, and then I'll put it on this course, and then of course I'll call you. So because you have to be emailed from the site to get this information. So so this is where I already got the video classes and stuff like that. And of course, we have a slew. I really see because one of the people that come to our food program for the longest time was like, and I've been invited her to come. She talked about gardening, one of the garden, and then she's like, "Oh, I see there's a class. Are you guys holding that?" Because she saw City of Berkeley's class. I was like, "Okay." I was like, so this will be a cool thing to keep going as long as we can, so we can really build a community, So, and then so of course I'll talk to Laura and we'll get the emails in this class so they can be invited to all the information. And there's a lot more. A lot. So like you said, seed saving, pest and pollinators, of course, vermicomposting, and all different aspects that you want to do to make a healthy garden, stuff like that, and even how to touch soil. So.
All right, I really appreciate y'all bearing in there with me. Thank you and look forward to seeing y'all next week.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Pastor.
All right, thank you all.
I just wanted to check.